with a lot to say, a lot to share. But we also know that we do have a very vibrant audience, and the numbers keep increasing as we can see from the participants joining. So you are welcome, participants, to put your, if you'd like to tell us where you're joining us from. But as soon as we start with the webinar, it would be good for us to just focus ourselves on the screen, and also, allow the opportunity to engage with questions, reflections in the chat box. So we will use the chat box for that function. It's also a place indeed to network, so feel free for those, as we're approaching the end, I guess, to share contact details. We do realize people are not meeting in the ordinary days of conferences, so it's the place you exchange your business cards, and that is fine. But maybe we can reserve that until the end. And it's good that we have, a global audience. I see some people writing that they're joining us from Kenya. You're welcome. Karibu sana. That's welcome in Swahili. And welcome to everyone else joining us from all parts of the world. So the chat room will be open for questions and reflections. And we're going to be engaging in a very interactive style with our panelists. So as we get into it, we have gone through, like I said, 21 of these objectives, very intertwined. Whether you're looking at legal pathways, whether we're trying to understand ethical recruitment, whether we're looking at documentation that's related to migrants and to people in general that allows them and facilitates safe migration, whether we're talking about saving lives, and like we were doing last week and in the last couple of weeks where we've been looking at diaspora. So really, I feel like we have gone through that spectrum of the migrant's journey. Last week we were looking at return, and I think that this is quite a subject that's related. It's while the migrant is away and when the migrant returns home. But our focus today is to understand a bit more about mechanisms for the portability of Social Security entitlements and earned benefits, and focusing really on Social Security benefits and social protection, if I may, for migrants. So I think what we're trying to ascertain here with this stellar panel that I will introduce in a moment, I think we want to understand a bit from this migration governance perspective. How is it really contributing to building the confidence of migrants from the time they take up employment to the time that they will end? How different does that look in terms of portability of your benefits? And how do international frameworks, do global frameworks, do regional frameworks actually support migrants and their families? What kind of balance is there in terms of responsibility around this objective? Whether we're looking at a whole of society approach, which is what we aim for, but is that what it looks like in practice? Do we really have trade unions, private sector engaged, civil society organizations sending countries? Where are they sitting in this discussion? Are they sitting at the back of the room and trying to sound the voice of migrants? Or are migrants shouting from outside the room while discussions are happening? So we also want to understand a bit the space that migrants have to be heard at the center of these discussions. Our panelists will also, just give us a glimpse in understanding the frameworks, like I explained before, that are existing out there. We're very happy to have ILO join us. So we will hear a bit more about, how has the Global Compact on migration and this particular objective come in to reinforce what ILO has been working around decent work, to put it very short. But I'm sure Clara will take us through in a much more consistent and comprehensive way as we understand social protection for workers in general. We also want to understand the best practices that are out there, and hopefully we can hear from some and understand the kind of limitations and inconsistencies that are there in the national social security systems. We want to know and understand, how can it be that a migrant is allowed to save, but is not allowed to withdraw? So it's like putting money into an empty pot. You can put in, but you can't take out. How can that happen? And in which areas has this been resolved, and how can we learn from this? What space is there to think outside the box? We really want to also know what are the boundaries of this box, and who is really involved in setting frameworks around this. We, like I said, portability of the social security entitlements and the earned benefits in their home countries when migrants are returning home. But what about migrants who are taking secondary journeys? I'm not really done with one destination and I'm ready to make a next one to a third country per se. What's really happening to their benefits as they are moving along the way? So this is why we have the panel, so that I could give that very quick intro. And without much further ado, let me introduce our panel. We have with us Ms. Sumita Santini Krishna, who is the director of Our Journey. We also have with us in the room Rafaela Greco Toneguti, who is the lead expert on migration and development at the Belgian Development Agency, Enable. We have Sister Lissy Joseph, the founder and promoter of Domestic Workers Movement. We have Mr. Lachman Basnet, who's the General Secretary of the Southern Asian Regional Trade Union Council. And last but not the least, we have Clara van Panhoes, who's the social protection specialist working in the department with ILO Geneva. So Sumita, as I bring you up and ask you to unmute yourself and open the screen, let me just start with Sumita. Sumita is an advocate and solicitor, and she's the sole proprietor of the Chambers of Sumita. She holds a law degree from the University of East London and was called to the Malaysian bar in 2005. She's a qualified mediator and is working on the panel of the Bar Council of the Malaysian Mediation Center. She's the director of Our Journey, which is an NGO platform for experts on migration issues to advocate with government, private sector, to develop supportive mechanism systems for non-citizens to be incorporated into international standards and norms. And she's the current chairperson of the Migrant Forum in Asia, which is a partner that is co-organizing this webinar. And this network, it's a regional network with membership in about 18 countries from the Middle East and from Asia, and advocating for the protection of migrant workers. Sumita, I can go on and on. You're a familiar face, but I think as you just come on, do you just want us to walk through what your experience has been like? And I know that you can be very visual, meaning that you're bringing back migrants to the center on this particular objective, and just run us through as you give us your first intervention. Over to you, Sumita.
Thank you, Paddy. So Objective 22, if you look at it, it's a lot about the social protection, but also about the portability of the social protection. So a lot of people view the need for social protection because that they feel that the migrant population is poor, and so they need some protection of the social protection. But I think that we must view social protection not from the welfare perspective, but as a human right. So you see a lot of the social protection being constructed as a restructuring and a poverty reduction system. But I feel that is not true, because example, locals, or even if we can say in my country, Malaysians, regardless of our wages, we enjoy free or heavily subsidized, example, medical treatment in public hospitals. So if social protection is a welfare benefit, then there would be a wage limit imposed for locals to access medical. As for migrant workers, documented or otherwise, they earn below the poverty line. They earn sometimes just the minimum wage or just slightly above it. But somehow governments do not see migrants as a population that would require access to social protection, similar to that of the poor population of the locals. So this is why we have many receiving countries with discriminatory national social protection systems. And if you can also see that receiving countries base their access to social protection of the documentation status of the migrant. And they justify that they limited duration of the period of, and they justify that with the limited duration of period of employment. So they say that that does not entitle them to a comprehensive social protection, example like retirement benefits or even unemployment benefits. So this is how the government has so far encompassed the social protection. a very, very different social protection for locals and a very different one for migrants, but at the same time justifying the one that they give for migrants in terms that they're not a permanent citizen in the country, they're just a temporary workforce, and that they will go back to their own country, and it's the country of origin that has to give social protection rather than the country of destination. So example, I would like to speak on Malaysia, who we do provide social protection for migrant workers, but it's not comprehensive. Example, in 2019, we extended our National Social Security Scheme for migrant workers to cover employment injuries and also occupational diseases, rising out of the cost of employment, as well as when you commute to work, any accidents that occur during commuting. But the coverage does not include loss of employment benefits, and which is an insurance offered only to Malaysians, although migrant workers also suffer loss of employment, right? So these are some of the examples, and many countries also deprive migrant workers of retirement schemes, and the argument is that they're just temporary workers and they would have to go back one day, so they're not going to retire in this country. So it is only right that they go back and avail themselves to the retirement benefits of the country of origin rather than the country of destination. So yeah, Paddy, let me just stop here before I continue later. Thank you.
I think already you've brought it into context, and I'll go straight to it. It's a discrimination issue, as you have put it. And I think that is discrimination from the angles, as you have put it, to say that if, those who are in the employment sector and at the low wage level as nationals would have access to certain services, and yet migrants who would similarly be at the same economic level may not have access to that. So essentially it's a discrimination thing. And at the same time, you've also shown us how the discrimination is really in cherry picking. What can we give to the migrants and what can we give to our nationals? I'm just wondering if we can come back to you, and you can let me know if we can do this now or we can take it on later, but maybe just a little bit now, and you can come back later on it. In sort of how do we then see from the migrants and from the involvement that you have had, even from MFA, from the MFA side, how does that then spin off, and that responsibility which has been pushed to the sending country, how are they really taking on? So what is happening at the end of the discrimination line for the migrant? What does it look like?
Paddy, there are countries, example like Indonesia, who have schemes that allow for migrants to contribute, even when they are abroad. And then when they come back to the country, they're able to avail themselves to the kind of money that is being kept for them. But it is only, it's very difficult. The criteria for migrants to access their own contribution in the country of origin is also very difficult. I understand even Nepal has a scheme where they could come, if they had suffered some injury in the country of destination, they could go back and also avail themselves to the insurance in the country of in Nepal. But I understand that it is also the fact that you have to be documented, and that you would have to be suffered some injury while working in your original employer. If you had moved employment, or if on your own, or if you had lost your documentation status, then you cannot avail yourself to that insurance scheme. So there are many hindrance that they put forward for migrants. They give them the benefits, but then they put a lot of criteria, a lot of red tapes, and then the migrant finds themselves that we actually do not have any benefits, even when we come back to our own country. So I think the first thing that countries of origin has to look at is not also discriminate against their own nationals. Migrants become undocumented for a variety of reasons, and they suffer losses and losses, as well as suffer injuries for a variety of reasons, and most of the times not on their fault of their own. So it is for the country of origins to also take on board that a lot of migrants do not have that ability to protect themselves in the country of destination. It is the employer who has to provide that protection, but it's not being given. So don't further, discriminate the said migrant in the country of origin itself. I think that's absolutely wrong. Thank you, Paddy.
You are absolutely right there, Sumita, in terms of understanding that it's a double discrimination that the migrants face. One from where they have been getting their bread and butter, and next from the country where they have been sending remittances. This is what we have just been talking about in the last couple of weeks, where we've been, as sending countries, we have been asking migrants to save us. And yet when it's time for us to save them, we have a lot of preconditions in our hands about what could you explain and could you justify what happened during the journey. I'm hoping we can come back to you to talk about two things. One that you already highlighted, the undocumented migrants, and just could you set it in the context of COVID? Because like you said, there could be circumstances that push migrants out of employment. And having been in Malaysia myself during the first lockdown, and it was just impossible, I think, for some migrants who are also used to sort of daily rates or who are paid as casual workers to have access to any kind of employment. And it's not everybody's job that could be converted into into a digital space. Some that are working as domestic workers, for instance, but could not maybe staying with that particular family or for one reason or another. Those who are working in construction were also affected. So just to try and understand, what did you see as Malaysia's way of opening up the social protection window to add those that were left out as part of this loss of employment, which was not due to a fault of their own, and then specific emphasis on the undocumented ones and maybe how civil society came in to support, and then a challenge, what's really happening at the regional level? If we've signed up to all sorts of processes at the regional level that of course may be non-binding but are sort of consultative processes. They are regional mechanisms that countries are coming together, sending and receiving countries within Asia, outside of Asia. What is really happening in terms of these regional organizations standing up for migrants, particularly in the context of COVID. But we can come back to that because I feel that it's quite loaded. And thank you for that first intervention. And we will now move to our next speaker, Lakshman Basnet, who is the former president of who is the general secretary of the Southern Asian Regional Trade Union Council. And Mr. Lakshman is really I think a regular with us here. We rely a lot on his expertise, even when we have been going and discussing other parts of the Global Compact for Migration webinar series. So he's not a new face for us. And he started his political career as an activist for the Nepali Congress in 1967. And he joined the trade union movement after the reestablishment of the NTUC in the 1990s, becoming its founding president and now serving as the general secretary. He has been a member of international trade union associations, and he's also a member of the ILO governing body from 1997 to 2009. And I'm bringing out all this to show how international his context is, but also how localized the issues he can bring and share with us here. And just as you are unmuting, I don't know, Lakshman, if your mic is on, but yes, could you just, super, could you just speak to us about what you see as the role of governments, the local bodies, the employers, in terms of establishing this secure social protection and social security system that we have been deliberating on?
Okay, thank you very much, Paddy. It's a great honor to me to speak here on social protection, and congratulations to you all, MFA and the whole family, for doing magnificently the 2022 GCM objectives very successfully with a very worldwide participation. And I'm very glad to be with you. Let me give you a small example of what I mean by social protection. for me, it's first of all, it's a recognition of the worker, the respect of the worker, and the dignity of a worker, so that when at times of need, he doesn't have to go and for any support from anybody. The second is about 22 years ago, we started a movement, the workers-led movement for the social protection and social security in Nepal. And it took us 22 years to get through the social protection bill from Parliament. 22 years. That's a hell of a lot of time for 22 years to work for workers. Workers are saying that, okay, we will contribute our salaries and the government has nothing to do with it. Employer will give us our top up, like 10% of our salary, and we deposit it in the bank and give it a protection, like Ilo says, 9 protections. So after 22 years, we have started with 4 protections in Nepal. And the whole thing is, the government is little sighing away. Government takes very great pride when they announced the social protection in Nepal that, okay, this is a new age. Of course, it was a new age, but very poor implementation. So the whole thing is, government has to realize that it is a must, and we have visualized it in this COVID-19 in last 1 year. Not only for migrant workers from GCC countries, they were crying for help from their country of destination, and they could not come back. Neither they had money to be fed there, and the employers just abandoned them. And if you have seen the march in India and Nepal, in India, there is an estimate of 1.15 crores, 150 million people walked from workplace to home. It was a biggest exodus in this century, with the free will. And so had happened in Nepal, because there was no social protection for them. They could not get any kind of a return ticket. So my opinion is the greatest social protection was given here by the local governments. They went to the border was locked. They went to the border and brought their people back to their villages, village development corporations or village municipalities, and they took care of them. So in my opinion, first of all, it has to be recognized as a dignity and respect. And then the sound mechanism policies, sound agreements and sound arrangement of social protection. There are a lot of sound arrangements all over the world. We can take example. And thirdly, it needs a standard contract. You cannot deceive my salary. You have to write down that you are entitled to so much of salary per month with all the facilities. And on top of that, employer has to deposit 10% of my salary in the social protection. So as the worker has to deposit, and it goes to around 7 or 8 or 9% interest in the bank. So that earns money. Suppose in the migrant destination country, he gets Nepal gets about at present gets around $10 billion per year as remittance. Suppose workers, employers deposit 10% of each for the social protection earned by the workers. How much money government gets it? That 20% of $10 billion every year. And if you deposit it in the foreign currency, the devaluation of the money goes so fast that poverty can be elevated. It can be reduced. It can be, disappearing. So my opinion is the social protection is not a legal thing. It's a more than a legal thing. It's a human thing. It's a human thing. You have to protect your own people. You have to put some money aside. So government is the most essential part of it, especially the local government. And I'll tell you a small story. I stayed in the United States in 1969 to 73, about 4 years. I had a Social Security card. I worked there for a while I was studying in the United States. And 2011, I went to United States again. I said, let's see, what is status of my Social Security? So I gave my name to the lady in the counter. And she said, Mr. Bassnett, sorry, your name is not here. So I remembered my Social Security number then, even after almost 50 years. So I said, okay, why don't you check this Social Security? So she pushed it in the computer, my number, 469682998. Then all my details comes. And she said, Mr. Bassnett, you have to work. You have worked here 15 quarters or 25 quarters. You have to work 15 more quarters. Then you are eligible. But at the same time, my friend, who was my roommate in India as a foreign student, he went to the United States. Now he gets almost about $5,000, $2,400 as a Social Security every month. So he is all secure. He's insured. He's insured. And all the benefits of Social Security, it's on his, even in COVID, the agency calls him, okay, Mr. Singh, you are dated on this to take the injection. So the government takes your interest. And when the pandemic support was given last time, he received money from the government. So these are the benefits. This is the earned benefit of a hard-working workers. So my opinion is Social Security should be very accessible. And after almost 40 years, I got my number from one place, and I could retrieve my number in other part of it was United States all over. I was registered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, state of Minnesota. Then I checked it in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. So after even 50 years, almost 50 years, they could give me my details. So these are the basic sound policy. Mm-hmm. Everything is taken care of the Social Security payment. It gives them respect. It gives them dignity. So it should be very easily accessible. Now what happens here? If you die in Qatar, the family comes from far away, from villages to Kathmandu or the center where the Social Security is given. And they get the insurance money. And almost 75% of the money is gone during the travel and everything. Mm-hmm. It should be very accessible in the village level municipality. That's where they reside. That's where it will attract the skills. Once you are entitled to Social Security, you have a skill. Or before you go, you can take loan from, if you have a standard contract, you can take loan from the bank. You don't have to go to the village money lender. So that, you don't have to pawn your land, your house, or all these things. So my opinion is Social Security is security all the time, from cradle to graveyard. Mm-hmm. So it should be very accessible to the. This is the very idea of the Agenda 22. It should be very accessible to the workers. You can go to the window and you say, okay, this is my number, give me my benefit. whatever, for medical treatment, for my education, children's education, for my anything, you name it. This is all I want to say right now. I think the local government should be the starting point of social protection. Thank you.
Mr. Basnet, I think, starting from the point of dignity, which is obviously something that is even enshrined in the, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the starting point, right? That we are really trying to preserve the dignity of the migrant and their family and making sure that they have access to their rights. And I think, you came in very timely with talking about the role of the local community itself. And I wanted, when you come back in your next intervention, maybe you could talk to us a bit more about the role of the employer, because I feel that, like you have said, is very much detached. Because I think that the employer, as it is in all types of employment, your social security starts with an employer's contribution. Now I'm thinking about undocumented migrants who in one end may have a saving, who maybe even want to contribute to some kind of a social welfare system that protects them, or a social security system that protects them in the event of loss of employment. And that is never really matched like it would be in normal circumstances when you have an employer. And what role are employers playing? One, where we have regular migration to support this migrant in, this portability of their benefits to go back home. And you can give us some examples from Nepal. And the other one is sort of this undocumented migrant, and what you sort of see could be more creative ways. Like you have said, it sounds like with all the technology we have, it sounds like we're still living in a very different century when it comes to registration. And I think this is something we've been talked about in terms of migrants just opening a bank account. And in some countries, it's not even about the level of skill that you have as a migrant, because even for high-skilled migrants are not able to open a bank account. And then, of course, the know your customer requirements that go with all this registration system. So maybe you, in the next intervention, you can just come back to us and talk to us about undocumented migrants, and we see how can they really be captured in, because we know that that's the reality. As migrants move from, let's say, parts of Southeast Asia, from South Asia, and take on jobs in the GCC countries, and would like to, and still manage to move around with different employers. So we would like to hear a little bit more on that, on how undocumented migrants can still have these rights, because it doesn't, it's regardless of status, according to the international provisions that we have. So it would be very nice to hear from you on that aspect. On this point, let me just introduce our next speaker. And please, the participants, you're encouraged to put your reflections and your questions, because in a bit we will go into a Q&A session. So it would be good if we could rapidly get into it. Let me ask Rafaela to join us. And as you unmute your mic, and we can already see you on video, let me just introduce Rafaela. Rafaela is a PhD holder, and she is a lead expert in migration and development at the Belgian Development Agency. She has a background in migration studies, and her PhD was in fundamental rights from the University of Pisa, Italy. And she has a master in international cooperation from the same university. And before joining the Belgian Development Agency, she worked as a migration expert for the European Commission, for the International Organization for Migration, for also the ICMPD, as well as UNODC, that is also working in the space of migration governance. She writes on migration and integration issues, and has recently published a novel on women on the move in the Mediterranean basin. We would like to pick your brain on that, Rafaela, when we get the chance. I hope we'll be able to, in the context of the question. And Rafaela, could you just speak to us a bit about, what you sort of see as your take on a bilateral cooperation agency? And here, when we're talking about, human mobility and social protection, we understand that. So we want to understand a bit more what the Belgian cooperation looks like, and how its, its work in terms of whether it's advocacy or actual services or, actual coordination around the work on human mobility and social protection. So it would be good to just hear from you, Rafaela. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Paddy, and thank you very much for having me here. It's, as you said, it's a stellar panel, and I'm really honored to be part of it. I'd like to answer your question by picking up on what the previous speakers were discussing regarding the 3 levels that I heard about. An individual level regarding the respect of fundamental rights of individual migrant workers, what I would call communities and territories level, where the local governance is called to act in making sure that existing laws or existing provision are granted to all people on the move, no matter what the stages of the administrative stages of the individual is, and a national, a systemic level, I would say, where governments are called in to establish those policies, and even regions are called in to establish those policies that make sure, and I will pick the sentence of the previous speakers that I liked very much, make sure that there is security all the time and everywhere. So these 3 layers are, the 3 of them, very important for bilateral actors like Belgium or the Belgian Development Agency, that is, of course, interacting in the first place with partner governments in partner countries, but also working very much at the local governance level and also in making sure that individuals get access to their fundamental rights. I will mention 4 things that I have heard very much on in the previous intervention. One is, previous speaker said, everything starts with the contract, the employment contract. So there is a level of making sure development programs, cooperation programs work on job creations and embed criteria, not just on ethical recruitment, but on portability of entitlements from the moment they support public and private sectors in partner countries in job creation. Second, right to work. Once the environment is created, making sure that everyone is respectful of their status, but also of their nationality or passports, they get the access to be trained, to be properly trained, to be employable, and eventually to work. Third, having these social security and social protection systems that are open to everyone working and residing and living on a specific territory, and promoting, assisting, supporting social dialogue on many different aspects in cooperation with international organizations and not just government. So if you ask me what is the take of a bilateral actor supporting cooperation on the 3 levels, individual, territories and systems, and on these 4 pillars, job creations, opening the doors also to cooperation with private sector, right to work, expanding social security, and promoting dialogue. You have mentioned so many things that also touch upon legal pathways, for instance, because if you talk about people who are on the move and who are working, you entail that these people have moved, but you don't talk about how they have moved and under what conditions of security they have moved. So since Belgium and the Belgian Development Agency is actively engaged in promoting legal pathways for labor migration, you can ask me and I will gladly answer that yes, these 4 pillars are taken care of in every program that we support. I take one example, for instance, between Belgium and Morocco, where we do work on a global skills partnership, on a skill partnership between Belgium and Morocco to address labor market needs at both ends, both in Belgium and in Morocco. And we work on the skilling on the Moroccan side. So the skilling is done in Morocco through Moroccan service providers in education that are, and in professional training, technical and professional training that are linked to the National Employment Agency, but also to the Confédération des Entreprises Marocaines, so the federation, the employers federation, in such a way that these social protection issues are embedded since the very beginning of the thinking on how you skill for what kind of jobs in countries on the move when people arrive, and in cooperation with actors, public and private, at both ends. So I will end up here because we were given 3 minutes and I would like to stick to that. But what is very important here that is to understand what are the challenges at all the very 4 levels: job creation, right to work, expanding security, and promoting dialogue, for the 3 broad categories: individuals and their fundamental rights, local governments and local actors, including the private sector, but also including the Association of Migrants and the trade unions, and the system, what it takes for these 4 and 3 to be in a dialogue, and what are the challenges. I can start listing and I will not finish by tomorrow. Very happy if you have questions on this. And I will challenge also my colleague Clara, who will speak afterwards on discussing also on definitions and indicators regarding decent and regarding protections, because sometimes it seems that it's a dialogue among death. We don't really define the same way, the same thing, and we hide behind the finger thanks to different definitions. Thank you very much.
Rafaela, thank you for that. In fact, you caught me on my last part in trying to sort of talk about the challenges that you've foreseen. I thank you for giving us that very direct example of how you're working with the Moroccan authorities in terms of skilling up. This question of skilling up, I give you this challenge. When we did, I think it's probably objective number 18, if I'm not mistaken, which we're talking about migrants and their skills. There was this fundamental question that kept on ringing. Who do we skill up migrants for? Do we skill up migrants because we would like them to, are we still using the lack of skills as an excuse not to provide employment for migrants? So I've paraphrased it, but it was as direct as that. And I think in saying this, we've also seen that come up when we have talked about returns. In terms of reintegration programs, where we're saying, yes, migrants need skills, but the big thing is that there are no jobs at home. And people make the journey because ends have to be met. So in saying all this, I wanted to sort of talk, I don't know how advanced you are with the program that you have, in terms of sort of really looking at migration from the point of view of the migrant, that they are moving, and that we cannot say to young Moroccans that they will get a job in Morocco, because they will not get the job in Morocco. They're looking for legal pathways to be opened up in Belgium, in Europe, and wherever else that migrants are seeking to improve their livelihoods. So what are we really doing also about recognizing this? And I'm always bringing in the angle of undocumented migrants because of the lack of a legal pathway, but also knowing that they're participating in economic activity, but being left out when it comes to social protection and benefits because they are not in a regular situation. So for the irregular migrants, how do you foresee bringing them in? I mean, it could also be an intermediate approach in the whole context of legal pathways and all the different pillars that you have around. So it's sort of a bit of a challenging question to sort of say, this is great, but given this reality, how are we refining our programs as well to address the problems that we have? And Clara will have that next challenge as well of trying to unpack for us from the ILO in understanding this issue as well around decent work, because we do know that there is no decent work. I mean, this is the ambition that we have. So it's sort of interim measures as we look forward to this very bright future, because that's where we all want to end. So that's one question that I would have for you, Rafaela. And I'm also just thinking from a regional perspective. We do know that migration into Europe is an important, I mean, you're attracting migrants, labor migrants from different parts. And do you sort of foresee having, and maybe here I bring in, for instance, the new EU Pact on Migration, what space is there in sort of this striking this new balance for responsibility and solidarity. And sorry, I'm playing with the words that they've used here, but in that way of sort of saying, are we looking, how migrant focused is it in terms of social security benefits and their portability? So Rafael, I think I've left you a lot to digest with. Let me introduce Clara. Clara, as you just come on, Clara van Panhoes, please correct me if I've not pronounced it well. And she's been working for the past 10 years in the Social Protection Department with the International Labour Organization in Geneva. And most recently, she has been in the branch that's dealing with conditions of work and equality. And she focuses on working with governments, employers, workers' associations, and organizations to extend social protection to migrant workers, refugees, and their families. Prior to this, she worked with UNHCR, with UNESCO, with ICRC, and other NGOs in countries such as Pakistan, in South Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also on the Thai-Myanmar border. Really sort of this wide spectrum, as well as, extending to humanitarian assistance. She has degrees in law and humanitarian assistance. And Clara, if you could come in here, I'm going to take advantage of your experience as well before ILO, and sort of think about this portability beyond the spectrum that we usually think about. And I think somehow it was when I also looked at your bio that I thought, oh, wait a minute, we haven't really touched on the portability of social benefits for other migrant groups. So it would be interesting if maybe even later on in your session, if you hadn't prepared for it, to come to it in terms of social protection. But could you also just talk to us in terms of these global solidarity frameworks, so for instance, the Global Compact on Migration, or for instance, the conventions, the ILO conventions that focus on social security, which have, recommendations that are pushing for social protection nets, and saying it's all workers, it's decent work for everybody. Therefore, if we cure the working environment for everyone, then migrants would fit in, coming to where Sumita was saying, it's a discrimination issue. But we know ILO conventions have been there before GCM. So what did we fail to understand as we came up with GCM? And do you see us moving in a different direction? And if not, how?
So hello, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to participate in this webinar on GCM Objective 22. I'm not sure where I should start because there were several questions in one question, let's say. But let's talk about the global solidarity frameworks and the opportunities basically it provides to us. First of all, let me just say that, I think during the last 12 months, a bit after the start of the current pandemic, we've seen and heard like manifold political kind of statements for support for social protection. I think this pandemic has shown even more than before how important the social protection is for all workers, not just migrant workers, of course. The ILO has a social protection monitor that monitors responses to the COVID, and I've counted about 1,600 social protection measures in 93% of all countries in response to COVID. So just social protection measures. And if I may, I want to make reference to my previous director, Michael Csos, who wrote an excellent article on development pathways, who makes a link to vaccines. He says social protection is like a vaccine against inequality and poverty. Of course, I totally agree with him. And he makes the link saying, same as for vaccines, countries who have a vaccine in place are better equipped against the health crisis. And countries with social protection in place are better equipped also against crisis, not just health, but also from an income security point of view. So of course, I'm pleading to, I hope, a kind of virtual room of participants that is already convinced about the need for social protection. But I think clearly this COVID is an opportunity because it has shown how important it is. And I hope we can ride on that bandwagon. the Global Compact for Safe and Orderly Regular Migration, and specifically Objective 22. The title talks about portability of social security entitlements and earned benefits, but actually if you read the details of that objective, it doesn't only talk about the policy options of bilateral and multilateral social security agreements, which are the ones that can facilitate, let's say, portability, but it also mentions the social protection floor, which is extremely important also for irregular and undocumented migrant workers or for workers working in the informal economy. So that's also in the GCM objective. It also talks about unilateral measures that are available to countries. So it's important to understand that there are several policy options. I think, of course, the policy option of concluding and implementing effectively in a non-discriminatory way bilateral social security agreements is definitely the most protective measure. And it's pretty much the only one that can really ensure the portability of earned, let's say, pension entitlements. But it's not the only thing we can do. And so we have also counted, together with ISA, how many social security agreements there are in the world right now. The map will be published soon. And we counted about 500 social security agreements. So I'm not talking about labor agreements, because you can also include social security provisions on equality of treatment, for example, in bilateral labor agreements, which is also mentioned in Objective 22 of the Global Compact. So, of course, with that in mind, we know there's a strong legal framework that governs the right to social security. Indeed, not just UN conventions, but also ILO standards. We have 2 ILO conventions specifically for migrant workers. But as you said, actually, all ILO conventions, unless it explicitly states that it's not applicable to migrant workers, but if it doesn't say that, then it applies to migrant workers because they're workers. This has been reiterated explicitly, for example, in the multilateral framework. So it's very clear for us. All conventions, ILO conventions and recommendations also apply to migrant workers unless they're explicitly excluded. So for example, a convention that is, I don't know, specifically for seafarers will say it's only for seafarers and not for all migrant workers, for example. So that's one. And then I would say, yeah, one last thing I wanted to say. So despite this strong legal framework, we've seen that actually it doesn't always translate in real effective access to healthcare and to social security benefits for all migrant workers. They still face numerous challenges. I think they face more challenges than nationals who have lived their whole life in a country accessing social security benefits. There's discrimination that was already mentioned, but it's also a lack of appropriate legal frameworks, a lack of social security agreements, as I said before. It's also a lack of knowledge, of information, lack of data, and of course, one of the biggest problems is if they have an irregular status, I would say. Was there another question that I missed that I should quickly mention?
No, I think you've covered. In fact, I've come up with more even follow-up questions, even listening, because it's absolutely interesting. And I think when you talk about sort of the failure at the national level to domesticate and to implement, maybe my follow-up question, and you can take it up here if you would like to, is more that, I mean, your constituent members are the countries. So when they sign up to ILO conventions, if I've understood right, you are also sort of, there's some kind of a monitoring mechanism that that allows to say, well, you signed up, so where does it really fit? Can we see the local legislation that allows this? Can we see the social security agreements that have come as a result of this? So what is that next step? And the reason why I ask this, in the room, we have a lot of students with us who've been following this as a certificate program. And often we talk about these global frameworks, these national frameworks, and they almost seem like they're powerless. And yet when GCM came on, and the same would go for the Global Compact for refugees, the world felt a bit empowered, even though one of them is non-binding. And then the point is, so then what? Why do we keep on gathering heads of states to sign up, starting with, national consultations, regional consultations, and also civil society working to advocate for a lot of this? Then who is the real driver behind it? So it's sort of a very contextual question in saying, very practically, then where does ILO take it when nothing is happening on the ground? And the other one is to say, what should we be doing about our frameworks to make them much more palatable, even though it's difficult for maybe for sending countries, receiving countries, or whoever is sitting around the table. I can imagine with trade unions or employers associations as well, having some kind of resistance because of a business model. So how are we really oiling this system so there's enough political appetite? And when I say political appetite, it's also looking at the different members of the negotiating table.
Okay. Indeed, I get this question or this a lot as a lawyer about the use of ILO conventions and UN instruments, especially if they're not applied at the national level. Well, I mean, of course, there's huge challenges, as I said, in the application of legal frameworks. Indeed, in the ILO, the UN conventions also have a supervisory mechanism, but the ILO conventions, as soon as a state has ratified a convention, they fall into this kind of mechanism where they need to report every few years the progress they made on aligning their national legislation to the obligations in that convention. So that's one. Then there's a few ILO conventions that are so fundamental that even if you have not ratified them, you still need to report on it because, well, you still need to apply these. So that's, for example, fundamental conventions on forced labor, on child labor, on the fundamental principles and rights at work. So that's one. And then, of course, so with this monitoring, they need to report. And then we have a committee that can make observations or that can request further information, or they can request a country to take steps to change basically the legislation. And the ILO is then also available to support with technical assistance on how to better align or how to change the legislation. If you have ratified, then a country can actually request this support and the ILO will provide the support. So that's kind of an additional benefit of ratifying a convention for a country. Of course, then another thing I want to say about the use of conventions, it creates a kind of policy space to discuss issues, I think, at the national level. It creates also, it helps, I think it helps civil society organizations and other stakeholders who want to advocate or lobby or talk to the government saying, we want this is an obligation you have. I think it helps, but you do need these groups to then hold their own government accountable, very important. Also, I think it doesn't just create a policy space to discuss these issues, but very importantly, it also can contribute to kind of a change of culture. Let me explain. For example, the Domestic Workers Convention. This was huge. It's huge to have domestic work being recognized as work. So domestic workers should also have holidays, leave, maximum hours of work like any other worker. And having a Domestic Workers Convention is just a recognition of this fact, a legal recognition, which hopefully then contributes to a kind of cultural change everywhere in the world. It's pretty much in all countries that there has been a problem recognizing domestic work as real work. And this is the same for social protection. I've heard this before from the other resource persons. Social protection is not charity. So when I talk about social protection, I interchangeably use the word social protection and social security to mean the same thing. So it includes contributory and non-contributory social security or social protection, social welfare, whatever you want to call it. In any case, even the non-contributory social protection is not charity. It's a legal entitlement. There's a right to a minimum life of dignity, a minimum access to healthcare. By the way, access to healthcare in international conventions, it's very clear it should be for all, irrespective of their status, including irregular migrants. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Clara, we could go on, and I see that the chat box is beaming with a lot of questions. I'm looking and I'm seeing ILO flashing. So when you have a moment, which I will let you go for the moment, as we will go to our next speaker. But something that you mentioned there, which was very interesting, and I thought I should bring back actually to Sumita at some point, talking about ILO conventions, and talking about for instance, the Domestic Workers Convention, where it's been ratified, how it's been ratified, and actually how it's being used. And I wanted also to hear a little bit from Sumita, whether, from her perspective, from the work that they're doing at Our Journey, but also from the Migrant Forum in Asia perspective, sort of how they see this application. And particularly, that's the question that I had attached, I think, to the role of, to what happened around COVID. So maybe we can get an example a little bit on the domestic worker front in terms of social protection in crisis, because that's also another thing. So maybe Clara, sorry, when you come back to us, okay, you've answered actually my question. Would have been important to see a little bit more of some very tangible national initiatives, but that also, not just like you have said, so many statements have been made at this level on social protection, but one that can help us really see the migrant a bit more visibly. I don't know if I'm making I can be as factual as that, because the sense sometimes is that the migrant, especially with ILO and the call for decent work, of course, like you have said, you are all encompassing in terms of workers. But if you felt that in particular areas, they were a group that was deliberately discriminated against, and therefore some kind of special measures had to be reinforced. And that could mean you were working with civil society, you were working with others, for instance, the International Organization for Migration, or you brought in other actors that you worked with to sort of reinforce an ILO, let's say, principle, an ILO convention that you're looking forward to have implemented. So we can come back to that. Let me come to our last speaker. Last but not the least, I'd like to introduce Lissy Joseph, who has just actually posed the question also. I think it's to Clara, she put the question. Lissy Joseph is the founder and promoter of Domestic Workers Movement Union, and an advocate for unorganized workers, especially women workers. And Lissy, you just, if your mic is unmuted and we can see you visibly. I just wanted to hear from your front as a human rights and a migrants activist. What would you say is the role that you have played as part of your organization, but also in your personal capacity, in terms of sort of this building up, the momentum, and making sure that the concerns of migrants on the portability of social security benefits and entitlements, has taken the ground that it needed. And I don't know if you want to put it within a national context or a regional context, or even an international context. Just walk us through some of the campaigns that you have done and that you have been involved in, and in terms of sort of sharing the strategies that have worked, or are still, you are still, crying your eyes out to say, look, like the stellar panel that we have in front of us, why can they not listen to this voice? Or why can they not look at these kind of initiatives, which would be interesting to take on? So Lissy, the floor is yours.
Good evening to all of you. I think it's a great privilege to be with all of you. And I just returned from a meeting with about 100 returning migrants, both men and women. And it had been a heartening experience to listen to them, especially at this time of pandemic. Hundreds of them, thousands of them have returned, some of them without being paid. Others had to leave because of certain other reasons, a number of reasons, especially the women workers. And as already mentioned, it had been an experience for the women workers trying possibility out to make their livelihood. For them, borders doesn't mean. They are looking at opportunities and possibilities to create employment wherein they hold responsibility for themselves to make livelihood options for their families. So that is a situation the women are and the workers are. And where we are speaking about regular, irregular, to them, these things doesn't matter so much that they are searching for employment opportunities. And as Basnet has just mentioned, the millions of workers who experience pandemic situation walking miles and miles from their place of destination to back to their home, it has been, I think, created a great history on the situations of migrant workers, whether it is in home country or in other places. So looking at the situations, as I said, just mentioned, the workers are going out to work, selling their services, and both the countries of origin and destinations have gained upon them on their economic front. And today we are in a context of globalization, network, technicality, all these. But when it comes to the rights of migrants, I see some of these things are taking backside. We say that there is no data, there is no this program, that these are excuses. I think we have found that there are already conventions existing. Ilo Conventions are there. Looking at the domestic workers C189, there is a contract and they have been given rights. But then in reality, situations are different. Similarly, all workers, when they are working, they are contributing to the economy of a country as well as the country of origin through their foreign exchange that they are bringing, especially in the context of Middle East. These workers who are brought, where is their portion for social security and how is it being transferred from one to another is a question. I think we as collective members, we all have a right and responsibility towards that, towards the worker. And that is how I have found. So our campaign had been to get to the grassroots to ensure that workers take the legal path and that they can claim social protection. So secondly, the responsibility of the government at both sending and receiving countries. So these, when there is a documented pathways, the workers should be enrolled and there should be their contribution and years of work. And we have seen number of years, workers, 20 years, 10 years, 30 years, they have worked and returned with nothing in the hand. So if that is the case, I think we are all together here to make that campaign, to make that lobby and advocacy and legal pathways to see how countries should respond or countries should respect the standards being set and the possibility created to bring back that experience as well as that portability of social security, whereby it may be the health, it may be the pension, it may be other forms of social security. India has #1 schemes like ESI, insurance of corporation. About 13 schemes have been enshrined into that, of which almost 11 have been kept even under the labor codes. And it's a wonderful scheme. But when it comes to the migrant workers, I think many of them do not experience. Some few states like Kerala has experimented and they have some security for the migrant workers. I think these good practices need to be replicated and we need to take this to others. So how all workers, irrespective of their status, should be given health care, that they should be given retirement benefit, they have worked enough, and that health care is very, very important. Similarly, or maybe accident. I met a person with accident who cannot now work. He almost worked in a place 10 years with an employer. And because of the accident at the workplace, he has returned and he has nothing. He has not been given anything. So where does he go? He cannot feed himself and his families. So these are all examples of hundreds and millions of workers who have returned. We have a number of patients who have come back on the stretchers. What happens to them? So how do we ensure? So I think lobby and advocacy had been our pathways, making the local government responsible to bring these agenda into the local administration, governance, and taking it forward from local to the national to the international. And I think we have certain mechanism already created. Even for the sending countries, we have the Colombo process, we have the receiving countries, the Abu Dhabi dialogue. We have many other networks that is on. I think some of these regional processes also should speak about this. And countries, I think I am very happy that a person from ILO is here. There are mechanisms established, and how do we monitor that? While business is on, how do we ensure the rights of people? I think it's very, very important. And together we can make that difference. I stop here and I will come back when it's possible.
Yes, please, it will be possible, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions also for you, Lissy, in sort of understanding how we're elevating the migrants' voice. And I get this too. I mean, this is the key, right? Because we need to know whose voice are we leaning to in terms of policies and practice and everything around migration governance, whether it's at the national level or whether it's at the regional level and even the continent, the global level. And I have seen, I browsed a bit and saw, some of the important work that your organization has also done in trying to raise these voices and not sort of remaining as a voice that's at the national level, but that also tries to speak to international spaces to say that we need to get back to where the heart of the matter is. And like, I like how you also brought in the fact that legal pathways is in essence what they're calling the cornerstone objective, isn't it? I often feel sometimes if you look at it, and not just that one, but the bulk of it, it would take away some of what we're having, because you have a much more maybe level playing ground. I would see trafficking disappearing, because then people would not rely on traffickers as facilitators. Smugglers would be out of business. But we are essentially, as a global community, putting people with bad practices into business by playing delaying tactics, whether we're coming from a political consideration or it's one of border security. So thank you very much for that. I wanted to just find out sort of from your side. You just said you returned from speaking with returnees and seeing some of the issues that they're facing. Do you feel that there was enough preparation for these returns? I mean, we have known that COVID is here. We didn't know how long it's going to be. I tend to think there is an overburdening of thinking how once everybody has a vaccine, the world comes back to normal, but there are a lot more problems to deal with. So returns will be inevitable. But do you get the sense that the local authorities are really prepared, and even to go to the full extent of not just supporting this portability of these social benefits, but also creating space where migrants can benefit from entitlement, maybe that they left behind before, or that they can have a much more creative way? Like you've said, we're in the wave of technology, we're in the wave of thinking new. So how can we think new? So maybe you can come back to us. I know that Rafaela may have to step out at some point. So I wondered, Rafaela, if you're still okay with us and you can give me a thumbs up so that, okay, good. So that I can just, before I come back to you, Lissy, I just wanted to pick a bit into the audience and see who we have with us, because we have quite a lot of questions there. I wondered if William is here. William, are you with us? And if you can give us your 5 cents on this one. William. And then if we can also unmute Richard Obedi, that would be great for us to hear from his side as well. Thank you, Sada, for just unmuting him. And I see Mr. Noel Eben is here with us from the Philippines, from Lawyers Beyond Borders. You're also welcome. So even as I mentioned the names, if you're unmuted, just give us your one, either that's a question or a reflection before we will go back to our panel and ask them to respond to the follow-up questions. Okay, Richard, you are there. You're welcome.
Yes, hello.
Go ahead,
hello?
Richard, we can hear you.
Yes, thank you so much, Paddy. Thank you for the panelists. I got impressed by the ILO lady, Clara. and then the last presenter, the last panelist. I'll speak in terms of the laxity, especially on the part of government and some of these international bodies. Okay, in my assertion, I would actually put ILO in perspective. Yeah, there are frameworks that needs to be followed, and this actually falls under their docket. In the case of Uganda, there are so many companies that are licensed by Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development. Even if the ministry comes up that, okay, we are suspending, about 4 or 5 months ago, Ugandan authorities suspended the recruitment of companies that are licensed to send domestic workers out. But still, you'll find in one or the other, they will beat this kind of racket or kind of this kind of authority. And at the end of it all, if it gets out of hand there, it dawns on Parliament, it dawns on the authorities. But then my point is, why is it that there's so much laxity in terms of enforcement of some of these? Okay, we have the frameworks, we have the provisions, things that are bringing us together. Why is it that we cannot enforce? Okay, for instance, let me put it at diplomatic levels. Say in the Middle East, say in Libya, in Middle East, maybe Qatar. Qatar is not, might be out of the picture. The country, I could say Saudi Arabia, where Ugandans are actually being abused there. Why can't we use maybe diplomatic arm to actually engage? I would even compel Parliament of Uganda to say, you know what, we are sending a delegation because there are 40, 60, 70 young girls who have been lured into by dealers, or maybe let me call them middlemen. And you find there's that laxity at the government level. Also on the other part, yes, that is my kind of disappointment with all this. Why can't we enforce it? Whether the Minister of Internal Affairs, Minister of Foreign Affairs, can we send a 15-man delegation? Or even the embassy, say Ugandan embassy in Saudi Arabia. Thank you.
That's a good one, Richard, on the role of sending countries within the host country. And in terms of ensuring that migrants are really being treated in a dignified way. And one would pose the question, if we knew that 24 nationals, young girls, were being abused in one way, what kind of actions do we take? And why do we take a different action when it's migrant workers? If we can, the next speaker, William, are you here with us? Okay. So then I go to Noel. Okay, Noel is not here. Eva, can I put you on the spot? Just give us a moment. It could be a matter of unmuting. Okay. Eva? All right, we can't seem to.
Ah, there it is. Sorry, I had trouble unmuting.
Go ahead.
I'm not very much an expert in this field, but certainly the question of portability of Social Security is of extreme importance. And I'm very much concerned that the question of repatriation at the moment during the crisis, the pandemic, falls very heavily on the shoulders of women who are not protected. And they are having real difficulty at borders, both in exit and in entrance. Many times they're being put in quarantine in situations that are particularly difficult for them, and they are not necessarily accepted in their home countries as well. This bothers me very much. They also come, as you have said, empty-handed, many of them, because they are not able to bring the money with them, or not able to access the money once they get into their own countries. And this is falling very particularly on domestic workers, who are, for the most part, women. I'm very, very concerned that, in general, the pandemic has taken away the advancement of women, the advancement that women have made over the last 20 years or so, that they are falling more and more into these more conventional roles, losing their employment, having to stay home to take care of children, etc. And this particularly falls upon undocumented women and upon migrants in general.
Thank you, Eva, for that, for sharing with us. I wonder if I could then go back to our panel, unless I will see a hand. Panelists, if you could also just have a look at the chat, if there's something specifically you would like to address. I will start with Rafaela in a moment, if I don't see any hands coming up. But I think we've had a couple of questions that touch on, I think, on various aspects, on sort of what's the blockage in terms of implementation. I think it seems there is a general consensus, and there's also, that's the presentations that have come from the panelists, that we are not short of frameworks. We're short of political will, we're short of taking the right action. So maybe I will go, I don't see any hands up, which is good. But thank you for the different questions in the chat. Rafaela, can I come back to you and also pick up with what Eva has just added in terms of, you know, the burden that is on women and young girls in terms of this sort of, you know, the phenomena and the loss of employment touching them, I think even in different angles. I'm also thinking here, it's sort of that move that if it's not their entitlements taken away, or they're not able to claim them when they have returned, they wouldn't have anyway anything much to start off, even when they have returned home. How are you, how are you sort of mainstreaming gender without really saying gender mainstreaming, because it's a term I don't like quite to use, because it just means how many women are you adding there? But you know, with this in mind, how are you ensuring that, you know, women's concerns are highlighted in some of the programs that you're doing? So Rafaela, we'll start with you, and we can take a tour de table.
Thank you very much, Paddy. I have noted so many things I would like to answer. I will try to squeeze everything in one answer, but I would like first to answer your initial question, because it's super relevant. Who do we skill up migrant for? Because it links to all the rest that has been said, and to your second question, what about people undocumented or overstayers, etc. So, and this links very much to the concern by Richard Obedi regarding Uganda and the engagement of sending countries. And there is where I stress the particular role that bilateral relations and bilateral cooperation can have, because they're through a positive angle in engaging in open legal pathways and ensuring ethical recruitment and embedding social security. I very much agree with Clara. Let's use social security and social protection in a very intertwined and interlinked way by engaging with national governments and local governments along these lines. Of course, you don't give an immediate solutions for those who are on the move and who are unprotected. So other measures also and other push towards policy will need to be there, but it is really the kind of exercise we are trying to do. So who are we skilling with? Who are we skilling for? We're skilling for giving opportunities to people to be employed, but also to embed and to provoke some mind shift and a push in policy will in order to start thinking altogether the skilling and employment exercise from a human rights perspective and from a migrant, and I don't even like to say migrant, from a worker, from a talent perspective. This is a long-term prospect. So how do you act in the meantime? Example, Uganda is a good case in point, not just as a sending countries, but also as a receiving countries. For instance, in the case of displaced people from South Sudan or from the Democratic Republic of Congo. There, the effort is to work at the national level with the Ministry of Education and Employment in such a way that vocational training and access to work opportunities are open also for those who are not Ugandan national, with the local districts in such a way that beyond the national provision and the national response plan, there are actual trainings that are open on areas that are relevant for the labor market in the specific district, so that you don't train in things that have nothing to do with the actual opportunities. And when I say training, there is included also access to funding. So trainings that also embed the possibility mainly for women to access funding, for instance, to start businesses or to contribute to businesses. And then actual, so job creation, but also ensure the access to work, the access to the right to work for all individuals, with a strong focus on women, not at all with the lens of gender mainstreaming, but actually starting from needs assessment in terms of what are the specific conditions that need to be there for women, not only to access those training, but also to access those funding opportunities, and therefore to be able to make the most of the possibility for employment that exists. This requires an engagement with partner countries. I speak as Belgian Development Agency, so Uganda, it is a partner country, but this also calls Belgian, and this I answer to one of the issues in the chat, this also calls for Belgian authorities, for Belgian institutions that are involved in this project. I talk about employment agencies in Belgium, in integration agencies in Belgium that are involved. This calls for them to start thinking along those lines. You may say this is a long road, this is indirect action, but this is where bilateral cooperation, governmental cooperation can really act upon the system in coordination with civil society, with trade unions, with representatives from employer, with international organization. This is a place where I feel that we can actually make the change happen. This is the leverage for change, I would say. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you for that, Rafaela. Lissy, can we come back to you on sort of the question that we asked? And I think I see you. It's great that you're also active in the chat in responding to some of the questions that are coming up there. But do you just want to give us some feedback?
As I look at, I think we need to start with the workers, the organization of workers, and raising their conscience, working together at the grassroots to the national to the international, workers of the world unite, I should say. That, and along with the contracts that has been mentioned, also bilateral agreement can go a long way. And I also see the need for attitudinal change that need to come in to the big players, the employment business, where there are lots of opportunity for networking. There is sharing of information. I think these are possibilities. And as mentioned, the standard setting whole process should work together along with what are the rights of, I think it's a right-based approach that we need to look at. And with these and the other players together, we can make a big difference to the workers, because workers are going out, not looking at the border, but opportunity for work. Even skill training should be based on the need and also preparing the workers for that, because workers are losing on, they are performing employment, but then may not be as for the requirement.
Lissy, you muted yourself. You muted yourself.
That can be done with countries taking responsibility for its workers and standing up together for the workers. I think that system of creating monitoring mechanism, networking, and global standard setting can go a long way in empowering workers. And this portability of social security, I think the number of workers who have left and they have all lost on that, it's also very. So can we make that possibility of workers being over the world networked, and there are roles to be played by all organizations, irrespective of their local as well as foreign workers, and that unionization, which is very difficult in many parts. I think that is one way forward. If the local workers are unionized and allowing the migrant workers to join them, and some of these issues could be raised, and then it is the business community that need to be brought into. And there, I think the role of the government becomes very, very important. And the standard setting by ILO and other organizations, UN organization, together can make this difference. And when workers have worked so many years, I think it is just right to get them back to what they have, so that they, especially the low skilled and the semi-skilled and women workers, does not go empty-handed. They continue to experience poverty when they have contributed to the economy of the country. I think I stop there, and I look at this possibility making it international. This is being talked about, like in India, we are looking at one card, one ration card, the PDS system being portable, the ID cards being portable. I think we are only just crossing over to the other border. This is possible everywhere. I believe that. And the power of people can change the situation. I believe that. Thank you.
I also believe that the power of, collective action, indeed, and it opens up and us having a much more open mind and knowing that change is possible through collective action. So thank you for that, Lissy. I think we could have, gone on and on. I just wanted to bring in here, and this is something has been talked about in the chat. I think I see Sumita has already also shared the link where Migrant Forum in Asia have a petition out there on wage theft. And this particularly, I think, would also be fitting in our conversation here, because it's looking at migrant workers who have returned home and have not even had the possibility to have their cases heard in terms of wages that they have left behind. And some whose employers may be holding on to their wages, some who've just lost their wages by virtue of not physically being able to be there and receive them. So I think it's campaigns like this, and there's a link which has been shared in the chat box. So I would encourage you to just read what the petition is for and go ahead and make your decision in terms of signing it. But I think initiatives like this remain important in highlighting and bringing this case forward. I also think that there is much more material. I'm thinking about a campaign that is happening out in Lebanon, where Ethiopian migrants, an Ethiopian run organization with financing that's coming from private individuals that is supporting those that have been kicked out of an employment system, and in some cases an abusive employment system. And this is predominantly young girls, and in some cases with their own children, that have to return home because that's the option that they have. So there's financing that's coming through, and it's essentially private. I think there's a story that was even running on Al Jazeera, if I'm not mistaken, a few weeks ago, where families and young girls are first being, put back into this space of feeling comfortable. You didn't make the wrong decision, but sort of you found yourself in a very unfortunate circumstance, which is very important, I think, in terms of also changing this mindset in terms of what can I have accessible. I think some of the comments that have also come in is sort of ensuring that if migrants know that if they return home and there is no space for you to get access to what you had as in your entitlement, it's even much more difficult for you to get to feel that you have access to this social protection base back home, and they end up falling, between the cracks and out of the systems without the support that they actually do need. So I think that's absolutely important that as we take all these things on board, we understand that we have loopholes. We may have the mechanisms and the frameworks, but we have these loopholes. I just thought it was important for me to point that out. Before I go back to the panel, I would take a detour that we usually do not do, because I see these hands raising are not going down. I will start with Tampi. Tampi, I'll give you 1 minute. And maybe a minute and a half to both, to Tampi, and then after to John. If you could just unmute Tampi for a minute, Sada, so he can give us, go ahead.
Thank you, Paddy. I think already I expressed the pandemic death, especially in Middle East, they are not caring, and even the dead body, they are not repatriating. So why can't you add in Malaysia, Shandini is telling it is added as pandemic death as occupational death, hazardous death. So why can't you treat? Because already they are losing their earning member, and even they can't see emotional and financial losses are too much for the sending country as well as for the family. So at least the financial compensation to an extent can compensate this. So why ILO and all this, to UN, you can represent these things. Even Middle East is doing wage theft. Pending salary itself they are not giving, and they are doing the very scientifically they are telling we can't repatriate the body because it is COVID. And I don't know to what extent, because there was no postmortem even. So many foul play can be done. Doctors telling, oh, it is COVID death. Who know it is COVID death or not? So it is a strong thing should be done from the trade union and from the other end. And most losers are from Asia and Africa. Keep it in mind. Thank you very much. Nothing more.
Tampi, thank you
Expecting
very
your
much.
answer for it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that comment on burden sharing and what it really should be looking like, particularly for allowing families, even for those who would not have had the opportunity to be with their loved ones, but to have closure. And I think we had a webinar also on it where we had quite a number of contributions in looking at helping families cope with migrants that have been, lost their lives during their migration journey. John, if you can come in for a minute.
Yeah, thank you very much, Patty, and I'm happy to follow Tampi's intervention a moment ago. So just a minute, if I can. I want to thank you and also Samita for responding to the question that I put in the chat box, because as I think about a portability of benefits or portability of any kind of earned earnings, we have to start with the earnings themselves. And if the earnings that migrant workers have worked for are not even themselves portable, it's very hard to think about benefits or rights or anything else that would be portable. So that's why I really I always think so with such enthusiasm of Migrant Forum in Asia's campaign to recover the unpaid wages. And so my question is really in that direction, not just in COVID time, but as MFA and other partners say in general, how to recover wages, and are we enough a part of that? And taking advantage of the wonderful presentation by Rafaela from Enable and also Clara from ILO, I'm just wondering if, as we all work in our organizations and networks, development agencies in Rafaela's case, very much Enable as a leading agency for development with migrants under the GCM and otherwise, and of course ILO. Is there a place for development agencies, government development agencies, to step forward, not just in implementation of the Global Compact for Migration, but for migrants and development to participate in this campaign, to figure out how better to make sure that migrants who have done work and have been promised a wage actually get that wage. And ILO as well, the protector of migrant workers and their rights, beginning very much close to the top of the list with earnings. Thank you.
John, a very timely intervention, and I think a relevant one. Why are we not seeing ILO? Why are we not seeing development agencies? Why are we not seeing development partners signing up or supporting, or how can they support? So Clara, you have a challenge coming up your sleeve. I'll give you 2 minutes to breathe and pass on to Sumita. As you regroup and think, I won't let you go on that one, Clara, but I'm sure you will help us, in giving us some kind of, I mean, it could also be, I know it's a big political statement, and you are only holding the social protection shoe here, but it's also to say, if this is what matters, why are you not doing something about it? But also knowing, having worked and supported, UN agencies, that it's sometimes not as easy as that. So we will look forward to hear from you, Clara, in a bit. Sumita, can I bring you back? We have missed your voice since you were earlier on, so could you just run us through? I think I gave you a massive amount of issues then. I kept on piling them as I was going along. So please feel free to just give us an intervention.
Yeah, so Patty, you mentioned about undocumented migrants and the COVID. So, even before the COVID, undocumented migrants never had access to social protection because they were undocumented. But then again, in Malaysia, let me give you an example of Malaysia where we had advanced that sort of protection to the undocumented workers, was using the court. So there were workers who were undocumented and worked and sustained injuries during their work, but were not entitled to any compensation because they were not paying any insurance, being undocumented. So there were lawyers who brought cases to court, and there are case precedents now, many case precedents now, held by the court that a worker is entitled to compensation regardless of his legal status. And that is already a set law in Malaysia. So but the only downside of that is that each time an undocumented migrant wants to obtain compensation, he has to go to the court again. So the government has still not adopted that court rulings into their policy, or neither have they put it into place in their procedures or standard operating procedures to give compensation to undocumented workers. So that is the downside. And of course, the fact that the undocumented worker has to go through the court process to obtain the compensation. So it's lengthy, it's expensive, so not all undocumented workers want to go through that process, but I think there are enough workers who have gone through that process and still want to go through that process. So it's just a matter of helping them go through that process of a court to obtain their compensation. And also to work, also for families who are abroad and where the worker who's undocumented has passed away here, even then, they could also seek compensation through a lawyer here, through a power attorney given to a lawyer here to file a civil suit in court for the compensation. So there are avenues opened up through the courts where the government has failed to give us that avenue. The courts has given us that avenue. And we have taken that avenue for the workers. But in time to come, I hope that the government will see the benefit of actually extending social protection to undocumented persons and workers in general, not only documented workers. So that's one of the points I wanted to mention to you. And also how CSOs have supported is like what I mentioned. We support by helping the migrant go through the court process, giving shelter, and accommodation for the workers while they are going through the process. In terms of ILO conventions, I think Clara made a very good point on the ILO conventions. But I think what is lacking in terms of implementation is the fact that a lot of the countries actually have not ratified these important conventions that specify on social protection. Even if they have ratified them, they have not actually, adapted it into the local legislation. So Malaysia is also one of the countries who have ratified social protection conventions, but we have not done much in adapting it into the local legislation, and we give a lot of excuses that we need time to study it. It's not time yet and things like that. Although ILO has constantly been pushing Malaysia to adopt and also to change the local legislations, and ILO has also extended technical assistance to Malaysian government for that. But still, you still need the political willpower for the government to do it, and it's not coming yet. So that's another thing, and that's another point I would like to put across. Thank you, Paddy.
Sumita, thank you for those interventions and also showing from the part of society organizations where you're taking care that people are not falling between the cracks as well, so that they don't get caught up with a legislation which is actually not accessible. Like you've said, if it requires for you to have legal representation, how would you do it if you didn't have it? So the law is there, but if it's expensive, if it's difficult to understand, I can guess also that the language, there could be a language barrier. So that whole translation of that, I don't know whether you'd call it a litigation process. I'm careful to use those words when I have lawyers with me in the room, remains relevant for migrants who may not have a good understanding of, of the legal process. So thank you for sharing those examples as well. Lachman, can I come to you?
Okay, thank you. So what do I say now? I think we have to understand the social protection is the first step, and the standard contract is the first step for the better migration governance policy. And it will benefit all the three parts, three partners. The country of destination, they will have a process to see who are legitimate, documented workers and those who are not documented workers. So I think the social protection should be given to all, irrespective of documented or not documented. You should give them the social protection to all. That's one thing that will create so many venues for development, for country of destination as well as country of origin. This is all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Lachman, for that. Clara, can I come to you with the list of concerns we have shared with you?
I may miss a few, and I also don't have much time. With respect to your first question on tangible social protection responses, including migrant workers, I'm just putting a link in the chat. I think you can find some real tangible country examples there. So then I don't need to detail them now because we don't have much time. And so then I wanted to talk about the wage theft campaign. I've seen quite a lot of questions on that. So indeed, this goes a little bit beyond just social protection, I would say. The thing is, the ILO, the question of non-payment of wages or the delayed payment of wages is it's a huge concern to the ILO too. As for the, let's say, official how do you say, validation of the campaign, or there was a question on why the ILO is not a formally accepted to support the campaign. I mean, informally we have, for example, disseminated the link to partners. We've mentioned it as part of our global media competition on labor migration, but we haven't formally completely endorsed the campaign for several reasons. First of all, the ILO, when you talk about the ILO, it's not just ILO International Labour Office or Secretariat. You're talking about the International Labour Organization. So we would have to ask all our constituents if they agree that we endorse it. And this takes time. So it's not, we are launching discussions and exploring if there's animo among our constituents to have a discussion on this topic, to see if probably there will be. And we have to follow the procedure to see what our constituents think, and if they, because they are the ILO, and if they want to endorse it, it's not, I'm not the ILO. I'm just representing the Secretariat, let's say. So that's one. And then I saw a comment also on how frankly the ILO is not very quick or speedy, which I must say, I totally agree. We're absolutely not speedy. However, we are slow, but you know, as compared to the other UN organizations, also we are tripartite, and it makes things sometimes even slower because it's even more political, and you don't have to just agree with governments, you have to agree also with worker and employer organizations. So sometimes this can make things even slower or even more complex or even more complicated. However, in the end, when they all agree, you have something much stronger, much stronger, also much more representative or much more socially responsive, because it includes the voice of workers. So I think, okay, fine, we're slow, but there's also advantages to being an organization that is so complex and that takes the time to get all this consensus from these tripartite partners. What else? Yeah, on the ratification of conventions, I wanted to say very quickly, because I still saw a lot of comments about them not being enforced or not being ratified widely, which is true. But something to really keep in mind is that actually, to provide equality of treatment to migrant workers, you don't need to ratify any convention. There's many countries that provide equality of treatment, and they have not ratified any migrant worker convention or social protection convention, and they still provide social protection to their population. It's ratification is not it should not be the ultimate, the only objective. I mean, it's about, I'm not saying this correctly. But anyway, so notwithstanding ratification, you can still apply equality of treatment. And then in that regard also, from a legal perspective, equality of treatment and non-discrimination is part of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, which is widely ratified. So, and I'm not saying this lightly, because I've seen that in national courts, they can use it also with regards to access to social protection, that the right in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is not respected with regards to equal access to social protection, with regards to non-discrimination. So there's not always a need to ratify conventions. But of course, it's a good first step. This was also already mentioned. It creates policy space, and yeah, and it helps also for other civil society organizations to hold their government accountable. And then the last question, there was also on the involvement of CSOs, if I can quickly reply to that. So yes, the ILO also works with civil society organizations and encourages their involvement in national dialogue processes. Of course, our primary constituents are work organizations, government and employer organizations, not civil society. But we also work with them. We work with academia, with NGOs, we have many projects also with them. So what can I say? They're very important. They're important to have as part of national dialogues. They're important for advocacy. They're important for information sharing. Often there's a lack of information and knowledge on what exists in terms of social protection rights. So very important. Thank you. That's all. Unless I missed something, then I'm all yours.
For this session, we'll let you go off the hook, Clara. I think you've addressed everything. Unless we had, I think I can give a minute to any of the panelists who wanted to counter-react to anything that has been mentioned or said. And then we will be able to wrap up in about a minute, because I think all the questions in the Q&A have been well addressed. So thank you to the panelists, for engaging also very actively in there as well. Any burning issues from anybody on the panel? Okay, so I think summarizing, I would never do any kind of success, because the topic is loaded, I think, as even, from the very start. But I sort of like this expression that seems to be running through. Okay. Sada, if you can help me. All right, good. Super. So I think we can well establish to say that social protection is something that starts at the start of the migration journey. So it just doesn't happen at the point of employment or at the point of actual return, but it's something that goes through the entire cycle of the migration journey. I think we've also established for ourselves here that we cannot move away from the linkage that social protection benefits and entitlements and their portability have with legal pathways as well as job creation. And that job creation goes in either space, but particularly also looking at the opening up of spaces and employment for migrants. And here sets in, decent work, where we touched on the issues that are related to, to dignity of the migrant as they take up employment in a foreign country, that they still do feel that the working environment is one that encompasses and is much more inclusive also for migrants, and seeks to make sure that it's not, have limitations or discriminatory practices that limit migrants to have full access. I think we've also talked about, how that workplace really has to look at a rights-based approach and really looking at the voice of migrants collectively, but that we can also not run away from the fact that governments will always take care of national workers, and therefore we still need to do a lot of work to make sure that that space is opened up to include migrant workers, particularly those who are low skilled. We've got a lot of question marks around undocumented migrants and how to help them navigate this social protection war. I think in some cases they have really seen it as a war. Some countries have inserted windows in this war, and we are, civil society organizations are really working behind this war and trying to either knock it down or, open up a few windows that allow access for migrants to have services, and for them eventually to be able to move their social benefits across. So it's really working from the in-space and all the way when they return home. We've discussed how a whole of society approach remains critical. The sending countries, they don't have the option to have a silent role in the room. They play a very big role in understanding what returns, and we've seen the impact of what returns would be like. Can we leverage on regional mechanisms and international provisions? Yes. But like many have sounded, it's all about the political will at the national level that needs to be pushed, and even sometimes at the subnational government level. The bilateral agencies essentially have a role to play in ensuring and in allowing host countries to open up systems, but also in providing support to sending countries, whether it's in skills, employment, financial inclusion, and also being advocates for policy changes in the migration space. The voice of migrant workers through networking and having this sort of rights-based approach remains very critical. We need to center back the conversation to the migrant and not to the national system, but really think about the migrant themselves and how these systems could be essentially important in terms of social protection, but also portability of social benefits. Change of culture. I liked how we started from sort of, one point where we talked about that it's also a safe migration thing, but I also like what Rafaela had said. It's sort of this change in mindset as well, which is very important, that we don't look at a migrant rights perspective, but how about we talk about a talent perspective? Does that really change? And it reminds me a lot of the articles that we're seeing around where, you know, the word migrant is being crossed out and human is coming back. So can we center it back to the human who is there to work, but coming from a foreign country? It's a mouthful, but actually maybe sometimes if we describe the situation as it is, we may find ourselves in a lesser, stickier situation. And last but not the least, we know processes are slow. Whichever institutions we're working with, whether it's the global space, the national space, we want them to be comprehensive, but we still remain with question marks around enforcement, which comes back again to the fact that it's a whole of society approach, and there are no excuses in terms of ensuring that migrants' rights are brought back to the center of GCM Objective number 22. So with that attempt, and I don't even think I've done justice to the wealth of information here, I would just like to thank all our panelists who joined us today. Sumita, thank you for being here. Clara, thank you for being here. Rafaela, Lissy, thank you for being here. I'm not sure if Rafaela was actually still with us. Lachman, thank you for being here, and thank you for all your contributions. We had, I think, at some point 120 plus participants. Thank you for your active participation, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.